All right. Well, it's good to see you again, Judy. Let me put this on speaker view now so we can, yeah. So I know I got to see you back, was it, I guess it's been a year and a half ago at the Carnivore convention.
Yes.
I had a nice chat and you've been doing some great work since that time. So you've got a
Thank
new
you.
book out, which yeah, I fortunately had a chance to read, and it's a very, very, very good book, very detailed, and I think very helpful for a lot of people. If you don't mind, can you just kind of give yourself a little bit of an introduction for let people know your background?
Yes. Hi, my name is Judy Cho, and I am also known as Nutrition with Judy, and I am a nutritional therapy practitioner. I have a private practice in Austin, Texas, and I work with a lot of clients also remotely. I work with primarily only meat-based clients, and I help them to get to root cause healing. I do a lot of graphics and blog posts on social media, and I'm a huge meat-based advocate because I healed from an eating disorder, mental health, depression, and all of that. And so I found true healing, and I'm just basically giving back now. And yeah, I wrote a book because I felt that there wasn't enough succinct information in one place, and I try to kind of capture that in one book.
Very good. And so let me ask you, because there's a little bit of well, I mean, there's different opinions on how meat-based diet should be implemented, and different thoughts on some of the physiology. And to your credit, you dug a lot, and I think there's a lot more nuance uh, out there. And so some of the topics that have been recently addressed, things about excessive cortisol expression in people on low carb, keto, carnivore
Yeah,
diets. There's concerns about, polyunsaturated fatty acids in different types of meat. Is that truly a problem? Should we all be avoiding pork and so on, or all kinds of pork? And then I know you go into a lot about gut health. So those are some of the topics I'd like to cover, and then we can talk a little
sure.
bit more some of the other things you might want to bring up. But let's first talk about, there's a concern that being on a ketogenic diet or not having carbs for a long period of time leads to excessive cortisol expression due to the requirements for gluconeogenesis, and that somehow leads to some sort of metabolic dysfunction. There's people such as, I guess, a guy named Ray Peat, who people
Yeah,
follow, and that sort of, and it may be a bit of a straw man thing here, but I mean, a lot of people I will advocate very oftentimes quite a bit of sugar type stuff, things like Coca-Cola, particularly the sucrose-based Coca-Colas, and lots of fructose and that sort of stuff. So what's your thought on the whole, you know, cortisol problem, gluconeogenesis problem without ingesting carbohydrates?
right. So for a lot of this year, I basically was kind of heads down working on the Carnivore Cure book. And then I saw a lot of people all of a sudden in the carnivore community. I don't know if it was COVID, the extra stress of being in this pandemic, and then, having that kind of cortisol rush just from stress. And so then people craving sugar. I don't know. But I saw people just starting to eat more sugar and saying, I need fruit for hormones, fructose, and all these things. And so I didn't know what was going on. And so I first thought, just some people were including fruits. And then I started hearing about repeat and how for hormones and thyroid and just for metabolic health that we need to incorporate sugars. And so at first I was like, this is crazy. And then I started doing some of the research because I don't want to live in this, bubble of, being really meat-based dogmatic. And so I started learning a little bit more about repeat and what his kind of beliefs are. And a lot of these kind of carnivore that's now introducing a lot of fruit and saying it's for hormone health, thyroid health, sleeping through the night. A lot of these people, it's because they're saying we're damaging our cellular health by not consuming any carbohydrates. And so what I kind of see in the social media space is a lot of people find a true like science fact and then they extrapolate it. So there is a slight truth to the fact that if you eat zero carb or low carb, your cortisol will be a little bit more, I guess, increased in the moments where maybe you're intermittent fasting, or when you also your body is producing glucose through gluconeogenesis. But that's not the whole picture, right? So if you just hear that and then you hear people say, so therefore you should eat a little bit of fruit, eat a little bit of sugar, I think for a lot of people, it gives them, yes, I have permission from these dietitians, from people that have done carnivore, and they're saying it doesn't work. So let me go back to orange juice. Let me go back to soda. I need it for my health. And the thing is, well, the whole issue, a lot of times why we get metabolic disease is because of the too much glucose, then the spike in insulin, and then the insulin not working, and then you have the rush of cortisol to balance your blood sugar. So if we get to root cause, sometimes the issue of metabolic disease is a overabundance of cortisol release. And so by going back to eating sugar, it kind of, it just does away with some of the healing we may have done on a meat-based diet. So does cortisol technically increase a little bit by being on a meat-based diet at certain points? Yes. I think there is a technical fact, but so does stress, right? Just imagining stress or your workload for the next day, that's also a cortisol release. So then should we not do that? If you don't sleep enough, that's a cortisol release too. If you work out too hard and constantly, so if you are constantly running marathons or you are doing CrossFit every day, those are also cortisol responses. So I just don't know why meat-based specifically is getting demonized for the cortisol response when there are so many things in our lifestyle that actually releases cortisol. And one thing I did as I was doing the research for Ray Peat is his kind of overarching diet is you should eat a lot of sugar in a day to not spike cortisol in your cells and cause cellular damage. But, for example, one glass of those Mexican colas has 39 grams of sugar. And even if it's sucrose, well, sucrose breaks down to glucose and fructose. So it's essentially the same thing as high fructose corn syrup. So fructose can only get absorbed by your liver, which is like 5 pounds, right? So or 3 pounds, sorry, but all of the fructose you're consuming has to be kind of filtered through by your liver. And secondly, our blood glucose, if you're at 80 milligrams per deciliter, which is kind of the standard healthy range, it's only about 4 grams or 4 teaspoons of sugar in your blood. I think it was 4 teaspoons. I'm kind of forgetting. Maybe it's 4. No, I'm sorry. It's 4 grams of sugar. And so it's about a little less than a teaspoon. And so the numbers, if you increase it to like 120 milligrams per deciliter, which is about a diabetic range, then it's about 1¼ teaspoon. So basically the difference between being healthy and diabetic is only 1/4 teaspoon of sugar. So if you think about it, when you are consuming 39 grams of sugar in just Coca-Cola or in orange juice, which probably has like 50 to, I'm not exactly sure, but if you keep doing this in every meal, then your glucose needs insulin. And then as that kind of starts breaking down, then you have to have cortisol from your adrenals to then even out that sugar load. So again, if your blood sugar is stable at like 4 grams of sugar, but then you are consuming even with one soda, 39 grams, think about how much stress that is on your body. And so when people are like, you need fruit for hormone health, it's your adrenals are supporting the cortisol. So what if it's actually, and the adrenals also work on your thyroid and all those hormones. So what if it's actually the sugar, and maybe you're just not eating enough on a carnivore diet? Maybe you're not producing enough fat, right? Cortisol is produced from cholesterol because it's a steroid hormone. And what if you're just not eating enough fat? I think in the carnivore community, I still see, especially a lot of women are scared of fat. So they will have a little bit of this fat on their steak, but then they still cut some of it off because they're like, oh, I just don't like the taste of it. But I really think there's still this fear of fat. So yeah, so that's kind of my point of view with the whole Ray Peat diet.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things. One, cortisol is, we need it just like we need insulin, just like we need glucose, just like we need cholesterol, all these things that we say, I think there's always this knee-jerk reaction that something in excess is considered bad, and therefore it should be as low as possible at all times, and that's not how the body works at all. And there's also different expression patterns for cortisol when it's, like you pointed out, when I exercise and I go out and when I do bike sprints, my cortisol is going high. These kind of regulatory hormones go way up when you're exercising hard to maintain a higher glucose temporarily so you can do those activities. We also know that, there's different enzymes that are produced that sort of convert cortisone into cortisol,
Yes.
11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which is expressed variably in different tissues, whether it's the liver, the kidneys, the fat, the vasculature, the nervous system, or the colon. And fructose, there's a nice study that shows fructose actually drives that enzyme quite a bit, leading to expression of higher levels of cortisol
Yes.
in the liver, in the fat, in the blood vessels, in the nervous system from taking in fructose. So fructose can actually drive up cortisol as well. And we also know that overexpression of cortisol is often seen with people with metabolic issues. And what we do see many times in most cases is metabolic issues clear up on a carnivore diet. So, and this is something, and I want to credit Amber O'Hearn looking at this in 2014. If you go to ketoic.org and look at her argument on gluconeogenesis, and I think another one on cortisol, some really nice stuff looking at the literature on that. So again, as you pointed out, repeat stuff, maybe some work from the 1970s, kind of old stuff that's been subsequently relooked at. And, there's a lot of confounding stuff there. Some of the recent data show it's different. And there are some benefits to cortisol as well. But let's talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids. I mean, I've had guests on here. I had Brad Marshall, who is raising low PUFA pigs, and because they believe that, pigs that are fed grains or soy are going to be severely unhealthy for us, and it's worse than canola oil or just as bad as canola oil. Can you put some perspective on that? I mean, should we be avoiding eating pork? Should we avoid eating chicken? I mean, is this the worst thing for us? Is there more context to this? How do we look at this?
So not getting too sciencey, I think it's kind of similar to the whole thought process of, not eating sugar and then sort of that cortisol response. So even if the polyunsaturated fatty acids are a little bit higher in like grocery bought chicken or pork, it's not what's causing metabolic disease, within the kind of greater population, right? So as long as when you are meat-based and you are, removing all the seed oil, so the soybean oil, the canola oil, and all those inflammatory vegetable oils, I think it's becomes non-negligible with the kind of grocery store pork and chicken. And I even had a conversation with Saladino about this, but I think we understand that it's kind of the perfect ideal diet. So if you were all of a sudden, you've been carnivore for a year and you're still not losing maybe the last 5-10 pounds and you're just trying to super optimize your body, maybe then you can try the chicken and pork removal at least, or eat the kind of PUFA less meats. But from all my clients, I have a client that does not eat beef because of his religion and he eats only chicken. He has a really hard time in gaining weight. He eats only chicken, eggs, and maybe a little bit of butter, but he has a really time holding weight. So I don't think it's just the isolation in PUFAs. I mean, I think there's definitely a factor with PUFAs in terms of soybean oils and canola because the numbers of PUFAs in those are extremely high, and also they're rancid and inflammatory. But I think when you are starting a carnivore diet, and even if you do it for years, honestly, I eat grocery-fed chicken and pork sometimes, and I mean, have no issues. So one, it's very bio-individual. So if you have a sensitivity to pork and chicken, maybe cut it out. But if you are scared because you're going to gain weight or you're not going to find all the healing, I have really yet to see that in my kind of practice. And, I think it's really just maybe this like slight maybe lever, but I don't think it's such a consequential thing, especially when you're meat-based.
Yeah, I mean, when you point out like populations, like, traditionally many of the Asian population, look at Japan, Hong Kong, and other parts of, Asia, where traditionally we've had very low rates of disease, excellent longevity rates. Pork is the number one meat eaten over there. And it's in large part, it's been grain fed for quite a while. And so, I mean, we see that we've got this, pork is the number one eaten meat product in the world. And most people don't realize that. But, when you look at particularly the population consumption in Asia, I mean, it's huge. I mean, there's 4.5 billion people in Asia. So most of our planet's population lives there. And, pork has been relied upon as a meat staple for centuries, quite honestly. And we don't see this. And so there's, and what's new to the population, and we're starting to see, as you probably are aware, in places like different parts of Asia, we're starting to see now the westernized transition to where, seed oils, high fructose corn syrup, refined carbohydrates, just processed, ultra processed food in general is what I would say. And as we probably all realize, once you take that stuff out, you get dramatically better. And whether we're fighting about a few, and I looked at, there's a study on pigs raised, these heritage pigs raised, the same breed of pig raised on grain and then fed, a grain-free diet, and the amount of differences was pretty minor.
Right. Right.
And then you got to remember that different breeds are going to produce different amounts, and it's very hard to predict. And I've talked to Fred Provenza, who is a rancher scientist who's looking at the differences, and they don't have any data showing in humans outside of a study in Australia looking at comparing grain-fed beef to kangaroo meat. And again, these are completely different species animals, and so the difference they looked at was slightly less postprandial inflammation, in the kangaroo meat versus the beef. And so the question is that, is it even an apples to apples comparison when you're looking at two different species? Is that relevant? When I exercise, there's an inflammatory response, which is normal. And so we don't even know the significance of some of the stuff. So hopefully we'll get some of that stuff there. You're big on gut health, and,
Yes.
you talk about a carnivore diet has been beneficial, but there may be more things we need to do. And I think this is important because a lot of people, and I think the gut does play a very important role. And I think we don't know it all yet. And I think these people that say this is the ideal microbiome and you need to be eating all these probiotics to make sure your firmicutes and your bacteroideal ratio is exactly this or that. I don't think that's where we're at. But what are your thoughts on gut health, and what are the things people may need to do in addition to a carnivore diet? Because it's, like I said, this is probably a good eating strategy, but just like exercise is good, just like sunlight is arguably good, just like getting good sleep is good, taking care of your gut in other ways is good. So let's talk a little bit about gut.
Sure. So in nutritional therapy, we learn about the foundations, which is basically that some of these core components of foundations, if they are impacted, then the downstream kind of consequences get affected. So for example, in the foundations is your gut health, and then there's blood sugar handling, essential fatty acids and minerals, and then everything else. So your immune system, your thyroid, hormones, adrenals, all of them, all of these kind of factors then get affected if any of these are damaged. And then if you look really deeply into gut health, everything is really impacted by your gut. So for example, so your small intestine is where like 70 to 80% of your nutrients are absorbed. 70 to 80% of your immune cells are in your small intestine. Most of your neurotransmitters are created in your small intestine. And then through the kind of brain gut connection, they're also, supporting the gut. A lot of the gut health then impacts the rest of the body. So the question then is, well, if you have been taking a lot of like antacids because you felt like you had heartburn, some of the PPIs, well, that also brings down a lot of your stomach acid and it raises the pH. And so then your stomach doesn't have enough stomach acid and it's not acidic enough to break down your meats, for example. And so then as it goes down the whole digestive process, how do you know that you are actually absorbing some of the nutrients? And this is something I actually see a lot in the community. So initially people go on the carnivore diet. So they remove all these processed foods, all the, polyunsaturated, all the like seed oils and all the excess glucose. And then they feel wonderful. But then as a few months pass, they start feeling a little less good. And so they're like, what happened? I'm eating the same. And now all of a sudden I don't have as good, or I don't have as good of the energy. And a lot of the clients I work with, some of them eat nose to tail, some of them eat only beef, some of them only eat grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and they're still struggling. And as I do this one assessment on my clients, and as I do it, the kind of overarching issue is gut health. So they've healed a lot, and their gut health shows that they've healed a lot because they don't have the bloat and they don't have as much poor digestion. But I think there are some symptoms that are kind of masked or band-aided by eating just a meat-based diet. And so they think they've healed, but over time it shows that maybe they're not fully healed. And so that's where I think sometimes, healing, repairing the gut. So one, if you just eat meat, you're helping there to be less toxins in the gut, but you also need to heal the gut. And so the thought process is that, just like our DNA only has a certain amount of code, and we have to now exogenously get some of our nutrition. So our micronutrients, our essential macronutrients, essential micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, we have to get from outside sources. And so the same thing, the thought is that for some of our gut health, once it's kind of damaged, we need to get some of those microbes from outside of our body, and some of it may not be in meat. And so, as you are healing from, for example, taking too many antibiotics or taking way too many medications that kind of damage your gut, or eating too many nuts, grains that have lectins, phytates, oxalates, all of those that kind of rip apart your gut, then maybe some healing should be done, and not just with meat. And that can be in like the thought of maybe just a little bit of probiotics for a little bit. And then you can kind of get to root cause healing. And then I don't think you need the probiotics long term. I think once you start eating a really clean diet with like meat, and just a meat-based diet, I think you can do a lot of the healing, and then you can get true gut healing. I just caution people that when they all of a sudden have less bloat, that, oh my gosh, my gut is really healed, but it might just be a mask and not fully healed. And that's my only kind of cautionary tale.
Yeah, and I think, part of that, you get this relative, for many people, it's a very rapid and relative improvement in symptoms.
Yes.
And you kind of, it's like, wow, it's shocking. And then you kind of hit this baseline. And so you don't, you kind of even out, and you're kind of like, well, it's kind of a relative feeling. And, you definitely know when you feel better. And then, so I think you kind of get this new baseline, your body reacclimates to that, and you don't maybe not feel, as wonderful every day, perhaps. Although I wake up pretty good most days, so I have to say I'm pretty happy with that. There's a question here from Sandy about, and I don't know if you care to weigh in on this stuff, but USDA dietary guidelines are set to come out later this year, and it looks like most likely they're going to be continuing a 10% cap on saturated fat. I know they proposed to even make it zero at some point, but thoughts on the evils of saturated fat, or the misconceptions around the evils of saturated fat? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we need cholesterol. For example, our brain is 60% cholesterol. I think it was in 2015, or maybe it was, I'm forgetting, but there was like not enough data on the cholesterol being damaging. And so the USDA, kind of behind closed doors, they removed the caps on these on cholesterol levels. And so I don't think, if we are saying saturated fat is demonized because of all of the research from Ansel Keys, well, he only came out with 7 countries that kind of fit his belief system. And I think he researched 22 countries, and there were a lot of countries that didn't fit his data. In the book, I talk about all these fears and misconceptions, and how it's just not right, and how the USDA and all, the World Health Organization, all of them are pushing like a high plant-based diet. They recommend canola oil as a safe oil. And, in the book, I show a graphic of how canola is made. They use bleach. It's made from rapeseed, which is a toxin to the human. And they somehow finagle it where they can just extrapolate some of the oil, and then it's considered a very healthy diet. I mean, a healthy oil. It's just, the logic is not there. I think people need to just understand that a grain diet is not working for us. And, if we know that meat actually heals us, and then why would we follow their daily value recommendations? And then why would we trust if they're saying that saturated fat is, not healthy for us, when it actually shows in our body that we really need it?
Yeah, and I think it also, we talk about saturated fat consumption. I know the Journal of American College of Cardiology and a lot of the authors on there, Krauss and Volek and some of the others have been critical of cholesterol sort of fear mongering for many years now. But one of the things they mention is, saturated fat is in the form of whole, sort of unprocessed natural foods, red meat, eggs, dairy, for the most part, have generally may not be unhealthy for us, and then we look at much of the saturated fat we get might be in products like processed foods, because they'll often mix those things, when you look at a Twinkie or some of the cookies, they have butter but then they have all this other garbage in there. And that's where a lot of people get quite a bit of their saturated fat as well. And then, the different types, whether it's oleic acid versus palmitic acid versus caprylic or caproic or, short chain, long chain, medium chain, they're all saturated fats and they have differential impacts. Let me ask you about, so you've been doing this for a while, you've seen some people, what kind of things have you been seeing getting better, health situations, diseases, getting better with a meat-based approach, overall, any kind of things that have surprised you?
Not really. I feel like most diseases are, better supported on a meat-based diet. So I personally have been doing carnivore for 2.5 years, and I struggled with an eating disorder, had really severe postpartum depression. My psychiatrist told me that I would have to take antidepressants for the rest of my life, and I've not had it for years, and I don't have any depressive kind of times. And then in terms of my clients, I mean, literally everything is, I don't think there's anything that can really be resolved by starting to use meat-based as like an elimination diet. So, obviously diabetes, all the metabolic diseases, they are supported and even sometimes reversed. Mental health is a huge thing that I see. And again, it makes sense because a lot of your neurotransmitters are made in your gut, and you also need a lot of fat to create, like you need cholesterol to help create these neurotransmitters. And a lot of stable moods, weight loss, hormone support. So I had a client that has been taking thyroid medication for 8 years, and as much as her T3 is lower, and then people argue, see, that shows that, this diet is not good for you. But again, these hormone panels don't really check the hormones in all the places, the blood and in like your urine. It's not, it's not comprehensive. It doesn't get the hormones in your tissues. And so that particular person, after working with, so she was grass-fed, grass-finished, nose to tail, it wasn't working. So then after 8 months of just kind of grinning and bearing it, started working with me, took a little bit of probiotics and, kind of shifted her macros. I was like, don't focus so much on the nose to tail, just eat what you enjoy as well. And so a few months into working with me, she's offered thyroid medication. Granted, she was dosing down already in the 8 months. And now she's sleeping through the night, feels so much better. She's starting to lose some of the excess weight she gained. I think she was following too closely the mantra of let's just eat 2 pounds of meat and everything will heal. She actually reverted and she was feeling more sick. But after she kind of found her own personalized carnivore, she's doing a lot better. I think the biggest thing I see is that people that couldn't sleep through the night are sleeping through the night. So as long as you kind of balance your macros, that really helps a lot. Allergies is huge. So as you heal your gut, again, as I was saying, that 80% of your immune system is in your gut. As you heal your gut and you eat a meat-based diet, then most people's seasonal allergies kind of diminish. And so they don't have to get on the Claritins and the medication, which also depletes nutrients. And just mucus and drainage and all that stuff seems to start to heal. Skin disorders is kind of like the last thing I'm seeing with eczema, psoriasis, but still improvement. So less flare-ups, but it takes a little bit longer, I noticed, than kind of any other disease.
Yeah, I mean, I think outside of probably inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, which can also take a while.
Yes.
I see the skin, and when I looked at this a couple of years ago, looking at the people doing the diet and surveying a lot of them, it seems like things like psoriasis, many people got a response, at least some response within the first month, but 50% of them it took longer, maybe 3 months, 6 months, even up to a year to see a significant resolution. So I wouldn't disagree with that. Do you, what was I going to say? Oh, so gut health. How do you assess that? I mean, we've had, I don't know if you listen, we had Dr. Pran Yoganathan, who's a gastroenterologist in Australia, talking about how he uses carnivore for himself and some of the patients he sees. But it's difficult to really assess gut health comprehensively. I mean, there's a lot of subjective stuff. I'm not bloated. I'm having regular bowel movements, that type of stuff. But are there any other, I mean, I know some people like this thing called an organic acids test. How are you assessing gut health?
Yeah, so I use all of those things. So definitely, I believe in symptoms is a huge thing, right? I believe that we have like an intuitive body and mind that we should listen to. Like for example, when you're going to eat rotten food, your body will immediately say, "Don't eat it," right? So there are truths to that. I think we should trust our health. But if you eat something, for example, and then your stomach kind of feels wrong after a couple hours, or you feel nauseous after a few hours, or if you're saying, "Hey, I can do a high fat diet, but if I eat too much fat, then I have loose stools." Like all of those are symptoms that something's a little off, and especially probably in your gut. But other than the symptoms, then you can also do like, so for example, SIBO has been shown to be most effective by doing a breath test. So you could do this breath test. You just breathe in and see after eating certain kinds of food, like what type of gas is released in your gut. There are stool tests that kind of indicate, but all of these are, not 100%. So you could do a ton of tests and then see like for sure what it is. There's like tests for H. pylori. So if you have possibly low stomach acid, you can do this test where they put a monitor and then stick it down your stomach and see what's going on. The H. pylori is another indication that you may have low stomach acid. You can do gut stuff. So IBS, SIBO, all of those are kind of indicated with the stool test. The oats test is another indication that you may have like candida or a little excess oxalates, and those are typically also correlated with gut health. And so all these things, but the thing is, the tricky part about gut health is that IBS and SIBO have very similar kind of symptoms. So does C. diff, so does H. pylori. So, and then some of the like H. pylori can then trigger eventually SIBO to happen, and then SIBO eventually with IBS. So it is difficult, but it's definitely if you have any lurking symptoms. So if you can't just eat 90% fat, or if you eat too much, you feel kind of nauseous, these are indications that something needs a little bit more support.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, you mentioned the SIBO breath test, among others, the hydrochloric acid test. And it's interesting that in our breath, we can test what gases are being eluted in our small intestine, which to me, and this is something, and again, I'll go back to Dr. Yoganathan's supposition that reflux is due to gases being produced within the gastrointestinal tract and maybe retrograde coming back up. And so what you see is, because many of us realize that eating a high fiber diet can bloat our guts, but we're thinking that fermentation is happening lower down in the intestines, large intestine, maybe a little bit in the small intestine, depending what's going on there, but generally not. But the fact that you could have some retrograde gas going up, just like what we see with belching in our stomach, but even the lower intestines, because it's going to go one way or the other. It's going to go up or down. And if it goes up, then it causes overpressure in the stomach, which exceeds that lower esophageal sphincter. And then you get this reflux coming up. And I think that's a pretty interesting insight, because it makes as much sense as anything else, because when we talk about what causes reflux, and people are saying, well, eating chocolate, or they just kind of have these spicy foods or whatever, but they don't have a mechanism. And then the treatment, of course, is just throw a PPI in there. It used to be, everybody was chewing on Tums and chewing on Zantac and all these things that kind of neutralize the stomach acid. Now we're telling our stomach not to produce it, and then you end up in this pH state that's too high, and then you get all kinds of problems secondary to that, even if there's even mineral problems with your bones and stuff. So
Yeah, I always say, so when I try to talk about digestive health, if you just think of it from even in your mouth, when you start seeing food, you start salivating and it produces salivary amylase. It's another digestive enzyme even in your mouth. And so the whole process, and I break down the process in the book because I think it's really important, but from your stomach all the way to your small intestine, large intestine, there are essentially three doors. So there's a door from your stomach to your esophagus, and then there's a door from your stomach to your small intestine, and there's one then from your small intestine to your large intestine. And so if any of those flaps kind of don't work properly, so for example, if you don't have enough stomach acid in your stomach, instead of the flap on the bottom from the stomach to the small intestine going down, all of this kind of gas increases in your stomach. And so the pressure starts opening up the top to the esophagus. And it's not that you have too much stomach acid that's causing the heartburn. It's actually the opposite. It's that you don't have enough. It's not breaking down the food in your stomach and then not opening the valve towards the small intestine to then continue the digestive process. So instead, a little bit of acid starts going up because the wrong door opens, right, to the esophagus, and then you feel a little bit of heartburn. And any amount of stomach acid in the esophagus will feel very acidic, but that doesn't mean we should be taking these PPIs. It's actually showing that you need more stomach support and you actually need more stomach acid. If you read the inserts, these stomach acids say do not take more than 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Most people take it for decades, and it's causing them to have, malnutrition. It's causing their stomach to have not enough acid to then break down their foods. And then how is the small intestine going to even absorb these nutrients? So this is where gut health is so important, and understanding the process will then maybe allow people to question if they want to start eating nuts again, or because again, the nuts, they're proteins and they can rip apart your small intestines, like the tight junction. So you just don't want these to happen, because it'll, then even if you eat high quality meats, you're not going to be absorbing the nutrients.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, and you talk, the pylorus and the ileoesophageal sphincter and the ileocecal valve is the the three sort of areas where we have these little control valves letting food in and out, and there's gastric emptying is controlled by the lower valve in the between the stomach and the small intestine and the duodenum. I think the point, it's a very good, I often say that digestion shouldn't hurt. Digestion should be almost something we don't even know is occurring. And if it's not, it's either you're eating the wrong diet or your gut is not healthy. And both of those conditions can exist. And certainly they can both exist at the same time. A lot of people have unhealthy guts and eat the wrong diet. But even on the right diet, and many of us would argue a carnivore or something similar is maybe a more optimal diet. Of course, there's people that disagree with that. But from our perspective, that seems to be the case. And many people will report gut health has never been better on a carnivore diet, which I think certainly there's some at least credence to that theory.
Yeah, and let me add to that. So when I was writing the book, I was making it more of an elimination diet, and I think a lot of people, as they try it, then the goal is kind of maybe you incorporate a lot of meat still in your diet. But if you look at every single elimination diet that's out there, so autoimmune paleo, the GAPS diet, all of these diets, all of them include pretty much all meats, and they exclude a lot of different kinds of fruits and vegetables. So there's no elimination diet that removes all fruits and vegetables, which I think is key. I think that's how you kind of get to baseline, and then you can heal your gut. And then if anything arises, like issues, that's when maybe you need a little bit more support. But there are some people that need nothing, right? So they just eat the meat-based diet and they're done. They're healing and they're living their best lives. And that's what's the most important. But there is no elimination diet that removes meat. There's none. Like I've done so much research in this area, and most people, they incorporate meat in their their diet to heal XYZ.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess the exception would be a vegan diet, which I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Maybe that's eliminating common sense. I'm just kidding on that, but I mean, and I think one of the things, and there's a couple questions in here. I want to answer those. So Brooke is asking about balancing macros and, fat, protein, of course, carbohydrate. So how do you sort of balance, what do you mean by balancing macros? And do you, and I guess I'll sort of add on to this because somebody else is asking about fermented foods, and then they're mentioning, kefir, and then also sauerkraut, which is obviously plant-based. And so what are your thoughts on balancing macros? And then if we are going to add back in some plant material, is fermented better than non-fermented? And I mean, because, I don't expect everybody on the planet to be a strict meat-only person the rest of their life. Some people are going to add back in a few other things. What are your thoughts on adding back in once you've got to this baseline? And what are your thoughts on balancing macros?
So macros, I think as I've worked with, my clientele is pretty much all meat-based. And so what I've noticed is that whole mantra of 2 pounds doesn't work for a lot of women, especially if you were metabolically damaged and if you had any hormone issues. And a lot of my clients actually kind of fit that, including myself. So I think when I was plant-based for 12 years and I was eating very heavy carb and no meat, I think I was kind of pre-diabetic without knowing it. I definitely had the mood swings and didn't, understand the whole like glucose insulin kind of roller coaster. And so for people that are not used to eating 2 pounds of meat to all of a sudden eat a ton of meat, it makes them have extreme fatigue. And then I always make all my clients check their blood work. And in the morning, some of them, even after 6 months of being on carnivore, their blood work still shows diabetic numbers. And so then we transition them to more like a 70-30, meaning that maybe they eat a pound of meat or a pound and a half, definitely broken up, right? So less tax on the digestive process by splitting up your meals and then adding more fat and then getting energy from the fat, even though, they have some weight to lose. It makes the big difference. So then they stop waking up in the middle of the night, their energy starts coming back. And so that's a huge thing I've noticed is I think we should focus on higher fat, especially if you've had metabolic disease and especially if you suffer from hormone health and if you've kind of underate your whole life. So those are big things. I think for men, my men clients, it doesn't seem to be as big of an issue. Some of the men, if they eat super high protein, like 3-4 pounds, I do notice they wake up in the middle of the night. So again, that's where I'm like, you should track. I'm more of a fan of the blood glucose, just checking your fingers. I think it's more accurate. So that's one thing. So I definitely think if you have any symptoms, so fatigue, overly full, you need a nap after a meal. In the mornings, your blood glucose is like over 100. Those numbers, I think then maybe you want to shift your macros. And then the second thing is in terms of, what was the second question? I forgot. Sorry.
So the fermented was fermented foods and adding back in, non-animal based foods back to the diet.
Yeah. So I think this is very bio-individual. So this is like a thing that a lot of people don't talk about, but if you have any fungal overgrowth, candida, if you have athlete's foot, vaginal itch, any of these things, jock itch, all of those things, then there's a sign that you may have an overgrowth of kind of fungal overgrowth. And so for those people, you don't want to be taking any fermented foods. You don't want to be taking the apple cider vinegar. You don't want to be consuming bone broth because there is a chance that the candida or these fungal overgrowths will feed the opportunistic yeast. So again, this is like a bio-individual thing, but otherwise, if you want to try it for your gut health and you feel good, then be it. But none of my clients do I require them to eat fermented vegetables. I don't personally eat it. I've tried kimchi like once and I just felt really bad. So I don't really touch it. But I've asked the people that I, work with their probiotics, and I asked, like, if we don't eat fermented foods, we don't eat prebiotics, how do these probiotics still work? And they've told me that these spore probiotics, they will work with whatever food you give them. So if you eat meat, then they'll work with the meat. But they do recommend, obviously, if you eat more fermented foods. But again, I don't think you need it for optimal health. There's a lot of anecdotal stories where there are countries that don't eat the sauerkraut and the kimchi and all the other fermented foods. If you feel like it's a benefit to your body, go for it, but I don't think it's required. And in terms of what are the safest kind of plants, I do have like a top 10 in my book, but in general, it's really bio-individual, meaning, so I'm creating this database of like 500 different foods. And then if you think about all the different foods and then across the top, it's all the different kind of components, factors. So oxalates, lectins, salicylates, FODMAP, AIP. So if you were to include everything, basically no vegetable should ever be eaten. But then depending on your own bio-individual needs. So for example, if you never had metabolic disease, you never had diabetes, maybe fruit isn't as bad for you, right? But if you did, maybe fruit isn't good for you. So these are things that I couldn't say definitively, like this certain food is safe. But in the book, like one example that I bring that I think is safer is probably broccoli, because you can actually cook down glucosinolates. You could boil it, you could steam it, and maybe 50% of it will be removed. It doesn't really have oxalates, lectins, phytates, and all those other anti-nutrients. And so broccoli is one of the top 10 that I do recommend. I know some people don't agree with that, but again, I think you have to kind of do this reintroduction, and I tell you how to kind of do this reintroduction in the book.
Yeah, broccoli wouldn't make it in my top 10 just because I don't like the way it tasted. So, but yeah. I mean, some people say there's, things like goitrogens or issues potentially. But let me ask you, because I maybe I'm mistaken, but I thought there was a video or a post you talked about apple cider vinegar, because we've heard a lot of the benefits. With apple cider vinegar may decrease postprandial glucose excursions. Yes. And again, this is assuming probably you're eating a lot of carbohydrates to eat it with, or there's actually science in the literature showing that diabetics that take 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar before bedtime a rise to 7% lower blood glucose, which is, reasonably significant. And I know I think maybe you were the one that said there's some caution with that. So can you talk a little bit about what are the potential pros and cons of apple cider vinegar?
Yeah, so I've read those facts too. I actually read it in Jason Fung's, I think it was his obesity code, if not the diabetic code. But one of them, he talks about if you want to eat, include a little bit of rice, you should eat it in cook it and then put it in the fridge, and then the resistant starch will have the less glucose absorbed. And then another thing he brings up is the apple cider vinegar. If you drink some a little before night, then your morning glucose will not be as high. But I think these are all hacks, and maybe we should just get to root cause. Apple cider vinegar, again, it's, for some people it works well. So they will take some a little bit right before they eat, and it can help because it will increase your stomach acid. So if your pH of your stomach acid is not between 1.5 and 3, then you will have a less chance of really breaking down your food and then being ready for the small intestine to absorb your nutrients. So in terms of apple cider vinegar, if your body can tolerate it, and again, listen to your body, if you don't really seem to have symptoms, and then after a meal, if you have no bloat, no burping, then that's a good sign that maybe it's helping. But again, for some people that have fungal overgrowth, that have the candidas and have had history of candida, have the, athlete's foot and all those, itchy stuff, then it's a sign that you may want to stay away because there might be some gut health issues, and the apple cider vinegar can actually feed it. So it's the pros and cons. And again, I keep saying it's bio individual, but for all my clients, there's no one answer to how much they need to eat or, what they need to do for gut health. But in general, I have seen that most women do better with a little bit less protein than 2 pounds in a higher fat diet.
Yeah. And I don't know where the idea that you have to eat 2 pounds. I know when I talk to people, I think initially you have to eat enough to overcome cravings, but this constant belief that you have to eat whatever amount is not based on anything that I'm not sure where that came from. Maybe it's just kind of poor extrapolation, but there are women that eat far more than 2 pounds, and a lot of women eat far less than 2 pounds. And I think it is a little bit individual based on your needs and how you're doing. And I think, certainly when we look at, blood glucose levels in general, and I think there's some caveats up, but in general, we see improvements with a little bit higher fat, a little less protein. That's not to say that we should not value protein, because it's extremely important that we get an adequate amount of protein to maintain lean muscle mass, particularly if you're exercising or want to build muscle. Then those things change quite a bit. But many women don't do that for whatever reason. A lot of women are less likely to get in the gym and lift weights and that type of stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you. When you first start, you should definitely eat enough. I think if you don't, I think the biggest issue that most women have or people have on carnivore is they're not eating enough, and then their hormones start, breaking down. And then that's when they are not sleeping through the night and they're losing their hair, they're losing their period. I really think it's because they're not eating enough fat and then even not eating enough protein. When we become carnivore, we kind of get in a ketogenic state. And then all of a sudden, for the first time, we don't get hangry, right? So we're like, yes, we can finally lose weight. We can finally lose the 20, 30, 50 pounds that we need to lose. And so people really start under eating. And I see it so often. And I think instead of blaming the diet, maybe you're just not eating enough. And then if you are eating enough and you just don't feel well, like you have fatigue, maybe you need to, eat 3 meals a day instead of 1. And then also consider, shifting your macros. But this diet can work. I just think you need to personalize it and see, because it's the most nutrient dense diet, right? And the most bioavailable, even if you have poor gut health. So that being said, why would this diet ideally not work, right? If you kind of figure out the levers that are making it not as optimal for you, I think there can be true healing with it.
Yeah, what are your thoughts? And I don't know if you've weighed in on this. I suspect you have, but I can't remember because I read your book a little while ago and I can't remember all the details. But fasting, good, bad, depends. What are your thoughts on fasting? Who needs to fast? Who shouldn't fast? Can we harm ourselves with fasting? Is it universally good? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so I think we naturally will get into a natural kind of intermittent fasting state where, I think a lot of complaints I get is I'm not hungry though, so I can't eat 2 meals or 3 meals. But so you'll automatically kind of get in a fasted state. But in terms of like extended fasting, maybe going over 20 hours, it really depends. So if you are morbidly obese, then trying to get your insulin lower will maybe be beneficial in terms of doing some extended fast. But if you are using fasting for compensation, so I had an eating disorder, so I can totally see the signs. So if you're like, I'm going to binge in this meal and like, oh crap, I ate too much. And now I'm just going to fast for 24 hours or 36 hours or, I ate off plan and now I'm going to fast. Those are eating disorder behaviors. Like that's not the way you should be using fasting. Fasting has scientifically so many benefits, but if you are using it for these reasons to kind of be orthorexic or anorexic, there, or even bulimic, like that's not helpful, right? If you are very high stressed right now and your hormones are kind of damaged, your adrenals are not functioning where you like get up and you get really dizzy, or in the mornings you have super low energy, all these things, and then you're drinking coffee and then you're not eating enough and you're not having enough fat, all of these reasons, then maybe fasting will just add fuel to the fire. And maybe during that time you don't want to fast. I do think fasting has its benefits. I think the autophagy, all of those powers are really good, but you have to know why you're fasting and if you're using it for true health or you're using it as kind of like a tool for unhealthy habits.
Yeah, I think there's definite benefits to thinking of it that way. It is a tool, and it's something that I think there's people that just kind of almost mindlessly say they've got to fast, got to fast, got to fast, and again, I always come back to the what's the goal here? The goal is the goal, and if the goal is to fast, if your only goal is I'm going to fast 36 hours every 3 days, I mean, then you got to think, well, what are you trying to solve? What issues are you solving with that? And you don't make the tools the end result. And the same thing with diet, same thing with exercise. It's, where we want to go, where we want to get. And I think some people kind of get too obsessed with that. I used to do that in my athletic performance. I would, my goal when I was throwing things was to throw something a certain distance, but I would get hung up on how much weight I was lifting, and they help, but they weren't really the goal. And I kind of get sidetracked with that. I see that a lot as well. What other things are you seeing that people are making mistakes with?
I guess not trusting their body, right? So, and I know it's common, right? We want to see people that have healed from this and their anecdotal stories, and then we want to copy it to the T. So people will ask, can I drink milk? Can I eat this? Can I eat that? How much should I eat in the morning? How long should I fast? And I really think that you can learn from the people that have been doing it for a while, but I purposely don't share how much I eat because I want people to kind of figure out their own, right? So I'll give you the educational content, and then you have to figure out what works for you. I think a lot of people, we are all genetically so different. We look different. We come from different metabolic health issues. And so you have to find what works for you. And for some people, maybe leaner protein actually does work more than higher fat, right? So figure out what works for you, but at least give it 100 days. I feel that most people kind of cheat in between that time. And then they say the diet didn't work, or, they didn't feel as good, or, they just give up on it. And I think it's so unfortunate because this diet can truly get you to root cause healing and kind of making you feel your best. And then you can kind of go from there as to, do I want to add vegetables back? Do I want to add some fruit? Whatever you want for your own lifestyle, but at least taste how it feels to be in that zero carb zen, how it, tastes to have healing and not be chained by food and sugars. And, like if we eat dinner really late, I have no issue because I'm never really hungry. I just eat when I need to. But I see even my husband, he gets hangry and he's like, I'm really hungry. I'm waiting for my food. It's taking forever. And I never get that. And it's a level of freedom that you cannot explain, whether it's mood, appetite, your health, waking up, energy levels. You don't have the 2 o'clock dip. It's this consistent feeling. And I think to only get there is you have to figure out what works for you, and don't force fasting if you don't like it. Don't force overeating if you don't like it, but, make sure to eat enough, and then be consistent at least for 100 days. I think 100 days would be a good marker to see how you feel.
Yeah, two things. One is, when we got survey data on about 12,000 people doing this diet, and we saw a pretty big inflection point at around the 90-day point. So, that 3-month doing it for 3 months seems to be a point where a lot of people see a significant, improvement. I think that's fair to say. So I think 100 days. And then somebody commented on doing your Carnivore 75 hard program. And I've seen you talk about that, and I saw people doing it, and I thought that's pretty cool. What exactly is it? What's the 70? There's other things you add in there if I'm not mistaken. Tell me about the 75 hard deal.
Yeah, so Andy Frisella, I think he has a supplement company. He's like a motivational speaker, but he has this thing called 75 Hard. It's like 5 components. I listened to it while I was, while right before the holidays were coming up, and I'm like, I'm just going to do my own Carnivore 75 Hard to make sure that I get through the holidays without eating, sweets and sugars. And so I just came up with 5 components. One was nutrition, which is just carnivore based, no sweeteners, no sugars, no sweeteners at all. So you can kind of get over the sugar addiction. The second thing was fasting. It was at least 16 hours. But then I said, obviously tune it to how it works for you. So if you're pregnant, for example, maybe you want to just do 12 hours, right? Things like that. And then the third thing was movement. So at least do 15 minutes of movement inside your house and then 15 minutes outside. But the requirement is at least 15 minutes. And that could be defined by you. It could be just walking. It could just be going outside, whatever it is that makes sense for you, but getting some of that outdoor even during the winter. So you will never know for 75 days how good or bad the weather will be, but you're forced to go outside, and that kind of builds resiliency, right? This whole thing is about mental resilience and how far you can overcome some of the mental blocks that you put on yourself. And so all of these were kind of furthering that. And then there was one on mindset. So what are 3 things you're grateful for today? And there are so many studies about if you have a positive mind and you think of positive things, or you stop focusing on the negative, then you can actually genuinely feel happier. And then the last thing was, it's like an acts of service. So it was like complimenting someone in the community or doing a random act of kindness. So there are a lot of studies that show that if you are giving to others rather than being just self-serving, that you are actually naturally happier. And then, it's a domino effect, right? So you make someone else happy by just a smile or a compliment of, hey, you look really nice today. And that person feels a little better, and maybe they'll give back. And then it's just kind of like this trickling down. So those 5 components, the requirement was to do it every day for 75 days. And then 75 days incorporates all kind of numbers or estimates they give in terms of how long it takes for a habit to stick. There's numbers of like 21 days versus 66, but 75 kind of incorporates all of it. And then I've seen a lot of healing. So we made it a community, like a free community event. I gave all these tools. And now I just made it a free school program. So you can take the program yourself, kind of learn about it. What's the importance of not consuming sweeteners, why we should do 75 days. And then community, there's a Facebook group, all of it's free. There's a ton of resources. I give you kind of mental health supports, like before you get started, like what's your why? If you are struggling, then create these if this, then that statement. So if you're struggling with wanting sugar, this is what I'm going to do, when I'm, in that state of mind. And so there's all these kind of homeworks that you can do beforehand. And there's just a ton of resources, there's community, but I have seen so many people that actually complete it to the end. And it's called hard because not most people don't complete it. It is a hard process, but I've seen people lose like 100 pounds, life-changing, you see these anecdotal stories, and it's really, really powerful.
Yeah, it sounds like a great program. And I do think, and this is something that I think is very much undervalued, but I think, what you point out is, when you help somebody out, when you make someone else smile, when you do a nice act, it does feed back to it does give you a little mental lift because you feel like, hey, I've been helpful to that person. And I think it does feed back on your own state of health. And so I think that's a great thing to include there. So I'm glad to hear that. Judy, we've come to an hour. I want to give you an opportunity. So your book, The Carnivore Cure, talk about where people can find it, and then also remind us where we can find you on social media.
Sure. So Carnivore Cure is actually not out yet. It's coming out on December 2nd. But if you buy now, and you could buy the ebook through Amazon, you could buy the paperback through our website, carnivorecure.com. There are 5 bonuses that you get that are only available during pre-sale. But once it's December 2nd, the book and the ebook will both be on Amazon. I think it'll still be on carnivorecure.com as well. So, I highly recommend people getting it. It's a resource for people that are brand new beginners. And it's also a resource just to fine tune, figure out gut health, figure out your personalized carnivore. There's macros, there's nutrient information. There's, your fears on fiber, vitamin C, cholesterol, saturated fats. Is this a bad diet for the environment? It is all talked about. I wanted a resource that someone can just go to and be like, okay, I can do this diet and I know it's good for me. I know it's good for the environment. I know it's good for people. There's a lifestyle component. I talk about the fasting, as you mentioned, how to increase longevity with like meditation, and how stress and sleep, they're so important to kind of manage. So all of those things are there. There's a ton of graphics, pictures, tables, because I know people like to learn visually as well. So yeah, that book is coming out December 2nd. And there's also an elimination way of eating it. So if you are really sick and you want to eat the cleanest meats, maybe it's just start with ruminant meat, for example. So that's kind of in the book, and it's spelled out on a week-to-week basis. And then the reintroduction protocol of how to kind of reintroduce first meats that you couldn't tolerate. Maybe they had higher histamine. So then how to incorporate that back. And then once you kind of are healing tremendously, then maybe if you want to add plants back, then you can. I personally feel better just on a meat-based diet, but not everyone wants to live that way. So that's that. And then for me, you can find me on nutritionwithjudy.com. I'm on Instagram, most active on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Judy, for doing this, and appreciate and keep up the good work. I know, and hopefully, I can't remember who sets up we've got a bunch of books listed on our website. So we'll hopefully, when that comes out, we'll include that on our website as a resource for people at NeaterX to utilize. So, all right, everybody, thank you so much. You guys have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you back tomorrow. I think we've got Dr. Ann Bosworth coming on tomorrow. So another good interview. And again, thanks, Judy. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Guys, I got a steak. I got a big ribeye to go eat. So you guys take care. All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thank you.